The soil does not remember the names of those who bleed into it, yet we act as if the earth is a ledger of our significance. We build structures of wood and bone, believing that the weight of a body can anchor a soul to a specific coordinate in space, but space is indifferent to the geometry of suffering. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the shadow of a master, where the air itself feels borrowed, and every breath is a debt that can never be fully repaid. We define ourselves by what we own and who we control, but ownership is a hallucination crafted by the finite mind to ward off the encroaching realization that we are merely temporary arrangements of matter. The daughter was a mountain of soft, yielding flesh, a monument to a father's excess and a mother's quiet disappearance into the wallpaper of the estate. She was kept in a room where the light only entered as an apology, and her father viewed her not as a person, but as a biological failure, a ledger of calories that refused to burn. He looked at her and saw the physical manifestation of his own decay, the bloating of his legacy, into something unrecognizable and heavy. To him, the slave was not a man, but a tool of precision, a living scalpel designed to carve out the shame he felt every time he looked at his own blood. He gave her to the darkness of the quarters, not as a gift, but as an exorcism, hoping that by placing his greatest failure into the hands of his greatest property, the two would cancel each other out in a void of mutual degradation. But the flesh has its own philosophy, and the body understands things that the mind is too terrified to articulate. In the damp heat of the cabin, where the smell of cedar and unwashed skin created a thick atmospheric pressure, the slave looked at the girl and did not see a monster or a victim. He saw a canvas of infinite weight, a geography of loneliness that mirrored the vast, empty plains of his own stolen history. He did not touch her with the violence of a man seeking revenge, nor the tenderness of a man seeking love, because both of those emotions require a belief in a future. Instead, he touched her with the clinical detachment of a God who has realized that the universe is made of nothing but meat and gravity. He began to work upon her body, not to harm it, but to reveal the fundamental truth that lies beneath the skin, which is that we are all just porous vessels waiting to be emptied. The father waited on the porch, sipping tea that tasted of copper and dust, convinced that he had authored a tragedy that would purify his lineage. He imagined screams, he imagined the breaking of bones, he imagined the crushing of a spirit that was already flattened by the weight of its own existence. But the silence that drifted from the quarters was more terrifying than any sound. It was a silence that suggested a rearrangement of the natural order, a quiet collapse of the hierarchy he had spent his entire life constructing. He did not realize that when you give someone total power over another, you are not testing their cruelty, but their capacity to see through the illusion of the self. The slave knew that the daughter's obesity was a form of armor, a way of becoming so large that she might eventually become the horizon, and thus escape the gaze of her father. He understood that her body was a protest against the scarcity of the world around her, a physical manifestation of a hunger that could never be satisfied, because it was not a hunger for food, but a hunger for evidence of her own existence. As he placed his hands upon her, he felt the slow, rhythmic pulse of a life that had been told it was a mistake. He began to move her not as a man moves a lover, but as a sculptor moves clay that is still wet with the memory of the riverbed. He was looking for the point where the flesh ends and the void begins, the precise intersection where the weight of a body becomes the weight of an era. The daughter did not cry out, because for the first time in her life, she felt the pressure of a gaze that did not require her to be smaller. She felt the heavy hands of the man who had been broken by her father, and in that contact, there was a transmission of a dark and ancient knowledge. They were two ends of the same spectrum of consumption, one consumed by work, and the other by the lack of it, both rendered invisible by the very system that claimed to define them. The father's pride was a brittle thing built on the assumption that the world is a series of walls, but in the darkness of that cabin the walls were dissolving. The slave began to strip away the layers of her identity, not through force, but through a terrifyingly patient recognition of her true form. He saw the way her skin stretched like the surface of a dying star, and he understood that all of human history is just a long, slow process of things expanding until they burst. He was not interested in her pain, because pain is common and cheap. He was interested in the way her body absorbed the light of the room until there was nothing left but a dense black hole of potential energy. Outside, the birds continued to sing as if the world were still the same, as if the sun were not a ticking clock counting down to the extinction of every word ever spoken. The plantation was a machine for the conversion of life into capital, but in that small space, a different kind of alchemy was occurring. The daughter was being unmade. She was being invited to stop being a daughter, to stop being a burden, to stop being a person, and to instead become an element. The slave worked with a focus that was indistinguishable from madness, guiding her toward a realization that the father could never comprehend, which is that the ultimate freedom is the loss of the self. He did not want to own her. He wanted to witness the moment her ego finally collapsed under the pressure of her own physical presence. The father pacing the floor of the big house felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He felt a thinning of the reality. He had inhabited a sense that the foundations of his world were not stone, but smoke. He had thought he was a master of destiny, but he was merely a child playing with shadows on a wall that was already crumbling. The daughter and the slave were no longer individuals. They were a single entity of mass and shadow, exploring the limits of what a soul can endure before it turns into stone. They were communicating in a language of touch that predated the invention of the tongue, a language of pressure and release that spoke of the inevitability of the grave. The slave knew that he would be killed for what he was doing, but he also knew that death is just another form of expansion, a way of finally occupying all the space you were denied in life. He was preparing her for the transition, making sure that when she finally left her body, she would do so not as a victim, but as a force of nature. He looked into her eyes and saw the reflection of a universe that was cold and empty and beautiful in its indifference. He realized that the father's cruelty was not a sign of strength, but a sign of a profound and pathetic fear of the dark. The daughter felt her heart slowing down, not out of failure, but out of a new and profound equilibrium. She was no longer a mountain. She was the tectonic plate beneath it. She was the slow, grinding movement of time that eventually turns everything to sand. The slave's hands were like a clock ticking out the seconds of a life that had finally found its true purpose. They were together in a state of grace that was indistinguishable from horror, because they had reached the end of hope and found that something much more substantial was waiting for them there. Hope is a tether that keeps us bound to the illusions of the masters, but when hope is gone, you are finally free to see the world as it is a chaotic sprawl of matter seeking rest. The father finally summoned the courage to walk toward the cabin, his boots clicking on the dry earth like the sound of a closing trap. He thought he was going to find a scene of carnage that would justify his hatred, but instead he found a scene of such profound stillness that it felt like he had stepped outside of time. The air in the cabin was thick and sweet with the smell of a ritual that had no name. He saw his daughter lying there, her vast body transformed into a landscape of quiet power, and he saw the slave sitting beside her not as a servant, but as a witness. The father opened his mouth to scream, to command, to reassert his authority, but no sound came out, because he realized in that moment that he no longer existed in their world. He was a ghost haunting his own life, a flickering image of a man who had forgotten that the earth does not belong to those who fence it. The daughter looked at him, and her eyes were not the eyes of a child, but the eyes of an ancient sea that has seen civilizations rise and fall. She saw through his clothes, through his skin, through his bones, to the small, trembling core of fear that was all he had left. The slave did not even look up. He was finished. He had completed the work of showing her how to be heavy enough to anchor herself to the void. The father backed away, tripping over his own shadow, feeling the sudden and overwhelming weight of his own insignificance. He realized that everything he had built was a lie, and that the only thing that was real was the cold, dark pulse of the earth that was waiting to swallow him whole. He ran back to the big house, but the house felt like a cage, and the mirrors showed him a man he did not recognize. He saw a man who had tried to play God and had only succeeded in becoming a demon of his own making. The daughter stayed in the cabin, and she began to grow even larger, not in body, but in presence, until she filled the room, until she filled the plantation, until she was the only thing that was real. The slave sat in the corner waiting for the end, knowing that he had done something that could never be undone. He had taken the master's most precious possession and turned it into a weapon of pure existence. The night fell over the fields like a heavy shroud, and the stars looked down with their blind, white eyes, indifferent to the suffering and the revelations of the small creatures below. We think that our lives are a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end, but we're just a series of events occurring in a vacuum. There is no meaning to be found in the struggle, only the realization that the struggle itself is a form of vanity. The daughter and the slave are the only ones who knew the truth, which is that the body is a prison, but the mind is the jailer. Once the jailer is dead, the prison becomes a temple. The father sat in his study, the lamp flickering as the oil ran low, and he realized that he could never go back to the way things were. He had seen behind the curtain, and what he had seen was a vast and hungry emptiness. He tried to think of his ancestors, of his pride, of his name, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. He was a man who had lost his shadow, and without a shadow a man is nothing but a trick of the light. The daughter, in her stillness, was more alive than she had ever been, because she was no longer waiting for permission to be. She was the weight of the world, and she was satisfied. The slave felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any sleep he had ever known. He had looked into the heart of the master's daughter and found his own soul staring back at him, and in that recognition, the chains had finally fallen away. Not the chains of iron, but the chains of belief. They were free in the way that a falling stone is free. They were moving toward the ground, and there was nothing left to stop them. The father began to hear the sound of the house, breathing, the wood expanding and contracting like a giant rib cage, and he realized that the plantation was not a place of life, but a place of slow and systematic death. Every brick had been laid with a curse, and every harvest was a theft from the future. He looked at his hands and saw the blood of generations staining his skin, a permanent map of his own damnation. He wanted to pray, but he didn't know the name of a God who would listen to a man who had sold his own soul for a piece of land. The daughter and the slave were now the masters of the silence, and the silence was growing. It was spreading from the cabin to the fields, to the house, to the river, until it swallowed the whole world. It was a silence that spoke of the end of all things, the quiet extinction of the human heart. We are born into a world of noise, and we spend our lives trying to make our own sound, but in the end, the silence always wins. It is the only thing that is eternal, the only thing that is true. The father felt the silence pressing against his chest like a heavy hand, and he knew that his time was over. He had been weighed in the balance and found wanting not by God, but by the very people he had tried to destroy. The daughter was the scale, and the slave was the weight, and he was the void between them. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine a world where he was still a man of power, but the image wouldn't come. All he could see was the daughter's body, a vast and beautiful landscape of flesh, and the slave's hands moving with the precision of destiny. He understood now that he had never been in control. He was just a witness to a process that had been set in motion long before he was born. The process of the universe trying to find its way back to the dark. The daughter felt the father's fear, and it was a sweet and distant thing like the smell of rain on a far-off horizon. She was no longer his daughter. She was the mother of her own liberation. She was the queen of the heavy things, and she was finally home. The slave smiled in the dark, a slow and secret smile that was the only light in the room. He had seen the end of the world, and it was beautiful. It was a place where there were no masters and no slaves, only the quiet movement of the stars and the steady pulse of the earth. He knew that the morning would bring the ropes and the fire, but it didn't matter. He had already escaped. He had gone to a place where they could never follow him, a place made of shadow and weight and the absolute certainty of the end. The father sat alone in the house, and he realized that he was the only one left who was still afraid. The daughter and the slave were gone, even though they were still in the cabin. They had transcended the limitations of the flesh, and become something else, something ancient and cold and perfect. He was the only one left in the prison of the self, and the door was locked from the inside. He looked at the lamp and watched as the flames sputtered and died, leaving him in a darkness so thick he could taste it. It was the taste of copper and dust and the realization that he was already dead. The daughter and the slave were the only ones who were truly alive because they were the only ones who had embraced the darkness. They were the architects of a new reality, a reality where the only law was the law of gravity and the only truth was the weight of the body. The plantation was a graveyard, and he was the only corpse that hadn't been buried yet. He could hear the earth calling to him a low and steady hum that promised nothing but the end of pain. He wanted to give into it to let the silence take him, but his fear was too great. He was a man who had built his whole life on the avoidance of the truth, and now the truth was the only thing left. The daughter felt the silence reaching its peak, a crescendo of nothingness that was more powerful than any storm. She was ready. She was the vessel, and she was full. The slave reached out one last time and touched her forehead, a final blessing for the journey ahead. They were leaving the world of men and entering the world of things, the world where everything is equal and everything is silent. They were becoming the soil, they were becoming the trees, they were becoming the wind that blows through the empty halls of the big house. They were free. The father stayed in his chair waiting for a morning that would never come. He was a prisoner of his own history, a man who had forgotten that the only way to own anything is to let it go. He had tried to own his daughter, and he had lost her. He had tried to own the slave, and he had been conquered by him. He was a master of nothing but a hollow empire of shadows. The darkness in the room began to move, to swirl like a thick liquid, and he felt himself being pulled into the center of it. He didn't fight it. He couldn't. He was too tired and too small. He was just a fragment of a dream that was finally ending. The daughter and the slave were the dreamers now, and they were dreaming of a world without him. They were dreaming of a world where the weight of a body was a gift and the darkness was a sanctuary. They were dreaming of the end, and it was a beautiful dream. The silence deepened until it was no longer a sound, but a physical sensation, a pressure that crushed the breath out of his lungs. He felt his heart stop, and for a brief moment he saw what they saw. He saw the vastness of the void and the terrifying beauty of the indifference of the universe. He saw that he was nothing, and in that realization he was finally at peace. But the peace didn't last because he was not allowed to escape so easily. He was forced to watch as his name was erased from the books, as his house was reclaimed by the vines, as his legacy turned to dust. He was forced to see that the world would go on without him, and that his life had been a flicker of light in an infinite tunnel of darkness. The daughter and the slave were the ones who remained. They were the true inheritors of the earth, because they were the only ones who knew how to live in the shadow of the end. They were the ones who understood that the only thing that matters is the weight of the moment and the silence that follows it. They were the masters now, and the world was their cabin. The night stretched on forever, a long and heavy darkness that would never be broken by the sun. It was the age of the flesh and the age of the shadow, and the father was nothing but a memory of a ghost. The daughter felt the slave's presence beside her, a steady and unwavering flame in the dark. They were together in a way that no two people had ever been together because they were no longer people. They were symbols of a truth that the world was not ready to hear. The truth that we are all just meat and bone waiting for the earth to reclaim us. The truth that all our structures of power and status are just toys we use to distract ourselves from the inevitable. The daughter was the truth, and the slave was the witness, and the father was the lie that had finally been exposed. The silence was the only thing that was left, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The daughter began to breathe in sync with the slave, a slow and heavy rhythm that echoed the pulse of the planet. They were the heartbeat of the world, and the world was finally at rest. The father's study was empty, the chair was cold, and the tea was a dark and bitter stain on the table. The master was gone, and the house was a hollow shell waiting for the wind to blow it down. The daughter and the slave were the only ones who knew what had happened, and they weren't telling. They were busy being the darkness, and it was a full-time job. The weight of the world was on their shoulders, and they carried it with a grace that was indistinguishable from despair. They were the only ones who knew that the end was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. It was the only thing that was real. It was the only thing that lasted. They sat in the dark and waited for the stars to go out one by one until there was nothing left but the two of them and the heavy, silent earth. They were the last of their kind and the first of a new one. They were the architects of the void, and they were satisfied with their work. The Father was a shadow of a shadow, a whisper in a storm that had already passed. He was nothing, and they were everything. The darkness was complete, and the silence was absolute. There was no more time and no more space, only the weight of the flesh and the memory of the light. The daughter and the slave were the only ones who remained, and they were enough. They were more than enough. They were the end. The earth began to soften beneath them, as if it were turning back into the primordial mud from which all things came. The cabin walls started to breathe, the wood becoming porous and damp, merging with the humid air of the swamp. The distinction between the inside and the outside was beginning to fail. The daughter could feel the roots of the ancient oaks reaching up through the floorboards, seeking the salt and the heat of her skin. She did not pull away. She welcomed the intrusion. She was becoming a part of the landscape. She was being digested by the world she had once inhabited as a stranger. The slave watched this transformation with a quiet intensity. He understood that the process of being consumed is the highest form of intimacy. To be taken apart by the elements, to have your atoms scattered back into the cycle of growth and decay, is the only true way to escape the prison of the self. He placed his hand on the floor and felt the vibration of the insects beneath the wood, the millions of tiny lives that were waiting to feast on the remains of the empire. He knew that the Father's house would be the first to go. The grand pillars would buckle, the silk would rot, and the gold would be buried under layers of silt and leaves. The Father's memory would be eaten by the worms, and his name would be forgotten by the wind. But the daughter would remain as a presence in the soil, as a heaviness in the air. She would be the spirit of the swamp, the goddess of the weight. The slave felt himself being drawn into her orbit, being pulled into the gravity of her becoming. He was no longer a man with a past or a future. He was a satellite circling a dying sun. He felt the coldness of the earth rising up to meet him, and he knew that it was time to let go of the last remnants of his humanity. Humanity is a costume we wear to hide our true nature, which is that of a predator or a prey. In the darkness of the cabin, they were neither. They were simply matter in motion. The Father, in his final moments of consciousness, had tried to grasp at the idea of justice, but justice is a human invention, a way of trying to impose order on a chaotic universe. There is no justice in the cycle of life and death, only the inevitable return to the source. The daughter understood this. She felt the weight of her body as a blessing, because it was the thing that would tie her to the earth long after her spirit had fled. She was a monument to the end of history. The slave began to hum a low, wordless tune that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. It was a song of the void, a lullaby for the end of the world. It was the sound of the ocean hitting the shore, of the wind howling through a canyon, of the stars burning out in the cold. It was the only song that had ever really mattered. The daughter closed her eyes and saw the universe as it really was, a vast and shimmering web of connections where every birth was a death and every death was a birth. She saw the Father as a tiny, insignificant speck of dust being blown away by the breath of time. She felt no hatred for him, only a profound and hollow pity. He had lived his whole life in fear of the very thing that was now giving her peace. He had spent his years trying to build walls when he should have been learning how to fall. The slave's song grew louder, filling the cabin, until the air itself seemed to be singing. The walls were gone now, replaced by a thick curtain of moss and vines. The sky was visible through the gaps in the roof, but it was not the sky of the world they had known. It was a sky of deep violet and bruised black, filled with stars that were unfamiliar and cold. They were no longer on the plantation. They were in the place between places, the threshold where reality dissolves. The daughter felt her body beginning to break apart, not in pain, but in a slow and deliberate expansion. She was becoming the moss, she was becoming the water, she was becoming the dark. She was the daughter of the earth, and the earth was finally reclaiming its own. The slave was right. There with her, his hands still resting on her skin, his presence a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her transformation. They were the only two things that were real in a world of illusions. The father's ghost, if it was still, there was nothing but a flicker of static in the background, a forgotten television in an empty room. He was irrelevant. The daughter and the slave were the new gods of this ruined world, and they were silent. They didn't need words, because words are for people who are still trying to explain themselves. They were beyond explanation. They were simply there. The weight of the daughter's body was now the weight of the entire universe, and she carried it with ease. She was the center of all things, the point where everything converged and everything disappeared. The slave smiled, his teeth white in the gloom. He had done what he came to do. He had shown her the truth, and in doing so he had found his own. They were free. They were finally free. The silence returned deeper and more profound than before. It was a silence that would last for 1,000 years, for 1,000,000 years, for eternity. It was the silence of a world that had finally stopped trying to be something it wasn't. It was the silence of the end. We think we are important because we can think and feel, but the stars don't think and the earth doesn't feel, and they are the ones who endure. We are just a fever dream that the universe is having, and sooner or later, we all have to wake up. The daughter and the slave had woken up. They were the only ones who were truly awake, and they were watching as the rest of the world continued to sleep. They were watching as the father's empire crumbled into nothingness, as the names of the great men were erased from the monuments, as the very concept of man was forgotten. They were the witnesses to the final act, and they were satisfied. The darkness was their home, and the silence was their language. They were the heavy things, and they were at rest. The father's study was now a cave of shadows where the dust motes danced in the moonlight like the ghosts of failed dreams. The chair was a throne of rot, and the tea was a puddle of oblivion. The master was a whisper in the tall grass, a sound that nobody heard and nobody remembered. The daughter and the slave were the only ones who remained, and they were enough. They were more than enough. They were the end and the beginning and the space in between. They were the truth that the world was too afraid to face. The truth that there is nothing but the weight and the dark and the silence. And it is beautiful. It is the only thing that is truly beautiful. The daughter felt the last of her human thoughts drifting away like smoke from a dying fire. She no longer remembered her name or the face of her mother or the sound of her father's voice. She only knew the feeling of the earth beneath her and the rhythm of the slave's breathing. She was a creature of pure sensation, a mountain of awareness. The slave, too, was fading into the background of the universe, becoming a shadow among shadows. He was the guardian of the threshold, the one who had opened the door, and now he was stepping through it himself. They were going to a place where there was no more hunger and no more pain and no more fear. A place where the light never reached and the silence never broke. They were going home. The plantation was gone. The world was gone. There was only the weight and the dark. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The daughter's heart gave one last slow thump, and then it stopped. But she didn't die. She just stopped being a person. She became the stillness. She became the absolute. The slave followed her into the void, his hand never leaving hers. They were two drops of water falling into a dark and bottomless well. They were together, and they were alone, and they were eternal. The silence swallowed them whole, and for the first time in history, there was peace. True peace. The peace of the stone and the star. The peace of the end. We spend our lives running from the dark, but the dark is the only thing that ever really waits for us. It is the destination. We all share the home we all forgotten. The daughter and the slave had found it, and they were never coming back. They were the lucky ones. They were the ones who had seen the truth and had the courage to embrace it. The father was still out there, somewhere wandering in the labyrinth of his own mind, trying to find a way back to a world that no longer existed. He was the one who was truly lost. He was the one who was truly alone. The daughter and the slave were the world now, and the world was a silent, heavy, beautiful place. The end was not a bang or a whimper, but a long, slow exhale. A release of tension that had been building for eons. The universe was finally catching its breath. And in that breath, the daughter and the slave were everything. They were the only things that had ever mattered. They were the weight and the dark and the silence. And they were satisfied. The memory of the father's house was a thin and tattered thing, a ghost of a ghost. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered anymore except the feeling of the earth and the rhythm of the silence. The daughter was the goddess of the heavy things, and the slave was her high priest, and they were at home in the void. They were the architects of the end, and their work was complete. The darkness was absolute, and the silence was perfect. There was no more light and no more sound, only the weight of the flesh and the memory of the end. And it was good. It was very good. The daughter felt the last of herself dissolving like salt in the ocean. She was no longer an obese daughter. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a human being. She was the vastness. She was the gravity that pulls all things toward the center. She felt the slave's spirit merging with hers, a quiet collision of two voids, creating a new and more profound emptiness. They were the negative space in the painting of existence, the part that gives the rest of it meaning. The father's cruelty had been the catalyst, but they had surpassed him in every way. He had tried to use them to define his own power, but they had used his power to transcend the very idea of definition. They were the unnameable. They were the ones who had looked into the abyss and found that the abyss was not a monster, but a mirror. They saw themselves in the nothingness, and they were not afraid. They were comforted. The world of men is a world of noise and distraction, a constant effort to avoid the realization of our own insignificance. We build cities and empires and religions to convince ourselves that we matter, but the earth doesn't care about our cities, and the stars don't care about our religions. The only thing that is real is the material world and the laws that govern it. The daughter and the slave had become the laws. They were the entropy that eventually claims everything. They were the decay that turns the oak tree into soil. They were the slow and patient movement of the glaciers. They were the truth that the world tries so hard to forget. The father's fear was the fear of the truth, the fear of losing his place in a hierarchy that was already a lie. He had spent his life fighting against the inevitable, and in the end, the inevitable had simply swallowed him. The daughter and the slave had not fought. They had surrendered. And in their surrender, they had found a power that the father could never imagine. The power of being nothing. The power of being the silence. They sat in the dark and watched as the last of the human world faded away. They saw the fires go out and the voices fall silent and the dreams turn to dust. They saw the end of the story, and they were the ones who wrote the final word. And that word was silence. It was a word that contained everything and nothing at the same time. It was the only word that was true. The daughter felt a sense of completion, a sense that she had finally reached the end of a very long and very difficult journey. She was no longer tired. She was no longer hungry. She was no longer heavy. She was the weight itself, and the weight was light. The slave was beside her, a shadow in the shadow, a part of the whole. They were the end, and they were the beginning. They were the truth. The darkness was their mother, and the silence was their father, and they were the children of the void. They were home. The father was gone. The house was gone. The plantation was gone. There was only the darkness and the silence and the weight. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The daughter and the slave were the only ones who remained, and they were satisfied. They were the architects of the end, and their work was perfect. The silence was absolute. The darkness was complete, and the world was finally at rest. We are all just stories told by a fool signifying nothing, but the daughter and the slave had stopped the story. They had closed the book and put it away. They were the ones who had seen the end, and they were the ones who had become it. They were the silence. They were the dark. They were the weight, and they were at peace. The father's legacy was a handful of ash scattered on a cold wind. His pride was a joke told in an empty room. His power was a shadow cast by a dying sun. He was nothing. The daughter and the slave were everything. They were the truth that the world was too afraid to see. They were the end. The silence was the only thing that was left, and it was beautiful. It was the only thing that was truly beautiful. The daughter and the slave sat in the dark and waited for the stars to go out, and they were not afraid. They were ready. They were the end. The silence was complete. The darkness was absolute, and it was enough. Continue.